How you doing, folks? You're watching Onward with Onrie. I'm your host, Kompan, and today I'm coming to you from Istanbul in Turkey, and I'm just got some downtime, so I figured I'd come on and answer some questions for you guys. So recently I've been asked the question how I went about looking for an artist. Now, this is a question I get asked quite a bit, and I decided to dig deep into coming up with an answer that goes beyond just answering the obvious things. And just to get that out of the way, the best place to start, I guess, would be to visit a few sites. I'm going to list them for you right now. The first one is digital webbing. You can post ads up there, and I'll get to what I think your ad should say in a little bit. You should also go to DeviantArt, and you can also look into different art agencies. I recommend Glasshouse Graphics and Space Goat Productions. You can contact reps from either of those companies, and they can pair you up with artists that have professional experience and know what they're doing. In fact, I think Glasshouse Graphics was where Mike Deodato got his big break, and they basically put him on the map. So they're basically, the way they work is they have scouts basically look for talent in all parts of the world. Typically, they focus in certain regions of the world. Like I think Glasshouse focuses mainly in South America and Asia, and I believe Space Coast Productions focuses more in the South America region too. But I think they look all over, so it's not limited to just one place. But that would be the best place to start in terms of just kind of looking. But now I want to kind of get into more about what it is that you're looking for specifically. Because you can find an artist, by asking someone if they want to draw a comic, in an art class. I'm sure you'll get interest from somebody. But if you really want to take this seriously and you really want to make something of it, there's a lot of things you need to consider. And I'm actually going to be referencing an article on the comic book art form that I read earlier this week by Will Eisner. And I'll kick it off with this. So, in the practice of the comic book art form, the artist/writer, for fundamentally he is both, is dealing with two major communicating devices, words and pictures. In their arrangement lies the structure for the expressive potential of this medium. So the way you need to go about looking for an artist is you need to first determine what style of art you envision for your project. And what I mean by that is there's all kinds of artists out there. And you need to find the right sequential artists who can tell a story with their art and whose art style actually fits the story you're trying to tell. Like there's a cartoony style, there's a more realistic style, there's a darker style, there's an exaggerated style. There's all kinds of different ways to go about creating comics. So it's important to first find the style that you envision for your project. Now, the best way to go about this, obviously, is to reference comic books that inspire you, or comic books that you think kind of have the same ideas that, or have the same approach that you do for your project. I'm not saying steal from them, but kind of use that as like as a benchmark for you, and then try and work off of that, and set your standards high. I mean, go for broke. If you're bootstrapping this is obviously something you're investing in. So put everything you can into it. All right. Now, aside from the style you're looking for, in order to kind of attract people, you're going to need to put a post up, an ad, and that you can post an ad on your website, and you can post it on digital webbing, DeviantArt. You can post it anywhere you want. There's a ton of places you can find on the internet where you can post ads, and of course you want to be careful about who you're trying to attract with this. But in the ad that you create, there's a couple things you want to make sure that you put in there in order to attract actual real professionals. The first thing is you want to be clear about what you want. So if you have an idea for a comic and it's 120 pages, you're saying you're looking for an artist to do 120 pages for your comic. and try and give them a timeline. If you can, if it's going to take 6 months to get the project done, or 3 months, or 4 months, whatever the case is, be clear about that. Also, you kind of want to ballpark on what you're willing to pay, and you can have a flat rate, or you could, say that compensation is negotiable. Uh, Whatever the case is, you want to pay your artist. I think that as much as artists love, uh, exposure, they're in this to get paid. I mean, that's kind of the idea here, and the same thing goes for you. I mean, you're not making your comic simply for exposure. You're also doing it to get yourself out there. All right, and once you have those points in there, it's pretty clear on where to go from there, and you just kind of have to put your time into this, and what you put into it is what you're essentially going to get out of it. If you don't put in a lot of time for it, you'll get an artist, and if they do shoddy work, it's not on them because you settled for it. If you want a really good artist, you really have to take your time to make sure that they really work for you, and I'll get to why that's important. Uh, because the third point I want to make right now is when you're hiring an artist, you need to ask yourself, does the artist serve the story? And what I mean by that is, I'm going to, again, read you something from Eisner, and then I'll get into it. So Eisner himself, in his essay on the comic book art form, says, "I regard the primal interaction between the reader and the creator as a form of contract. This is true in the code alphabet of the written language, as well as in the sounds of oral communication." So what Eisner is trying to illustrate in his really brilliant essay on comic art is that making comics is not just putting art and words together. It's a language. It's a way of communicating with your reader, and who you choose to write that language with is what's going to determine how strong your project is. Which is why I think it's very important that you don't settle. You need to set the terms of what you expect from the artist. Their work should be subject to your approval and your approval only, because you're the one who's fitting the bill at the end of the day. And you also have to be considerate of the fact that though the artist is one of the most important expenses that you're going to have with your comic, it's not the only expense. There's going to be other expenses that come with it. If you decide to color your book, if you decide to ink it, you're obviously going to letter it, you're going to print it. Whatever the case is, they're not the only thing you have to consider. You also have to consider paying yourself at some point. Otherwise, why are you doing it? So you have to make sure that whoever you're working with is somebody that is compatible with you. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with asking artists who submit to you to provide concepts based on your ideas, because if you guys don't mesh well, the project's just not going to work. And it can take you time to find an artist. For me, I remember when back in 2008 when I hired Giovanni Timpano, it took a good 3 months to find them. And I was searching near and far. I had submissions coming into me daily, and a lot of them didn't fit the bill. And I had to send a lot of rejection letters, and that's never fun. But I mean, it just needs to be done, and it's nothing personal. You got to find the right person for the job. And when I came across Giovanni, 3 months later, I had come to a point where I was like just ready to give up on this period, because I just didn't feel like I could attract the right people. I mean, I went to guys who had worked at Marvel and DC, and they were too busy to work for me. And there was other guys who worked at smaller publications who got bigger jobs that they could count on and all this stuff. And here I was, just getting started, and I had to find somebody who was willing to grow with me as I got into this business. So, I mean, that's not an easy thing to do. And, when I was looking for Giovanni's replacement on Yisum Shin, LR Nucleus, that also took some time too. And it took a lot of testing. Giovanni left Yisum Shin after the fifth issue. And my biggest challenge after he departed was finding his replacement as quickly as possible so that we could keep production on schedule. And when David Anthony Kraft and I came across L's portfolio, we liked what we saw, but we needed to test him and make sure that he could keep up with the demands of the book. And we must have spent like a good 2 months testing Alan. I mean, it's not only a test for the artist; it's a test for you to see if you can work with them and if you guys can kind of come to an agreement of what's expected. Because if you can't do that, the project is going to suffer, and the reader is the one who's going to pay the price for it. So you have to keep these things in mind. Sometimes it's better to put in the extra effort. Sometimes it's better to be patient and wait for the right person to come, because they will. There is the right artist out there for your project. There's no need for you to settle. Take your time with this, especially if you're the one footing the bill. This is your money. You had to get it somehow, whether you're borrowing it from someone or had to work a job you hated in order to save up just so you can make this one comic happen. All right, so just take your time with it. Now, I'm going to answer a question that was asked to me from one of our listeners today. He asked me, how do you write believable dialogue that flows and fits the time period? I always have trouble when it comes to dialogue. Often my test readers said that my characters talk like badly translated foreign films or like robots through a Microsoft mic. Any tips or advice would be greatly appreciated. The way I write dialogue is I think about what the character would say. I don't think about the historical context of stuff. I mean, if you've read Yu Sun Shin, and you know that we write the book in a present text format. I mean, we're not using slang, but we're speaking to our audience, and in a way that makes sense to them. Because truth be told, aside from historical documents which have been translated multiple times, no one really knows how anyone talked back in 1592. No one knows how anybody talked in 1485, okay? These were different times. If you think about it, language has changed over a vast span of time, even a span of time like 10 years. I mean, think about this. In terms of slang, there are slang terms that were hip 10 years ago. Even the word hip now is not hip anymore. You know what I mean? It's like you can't get caught up in that stuff. The most important thing is this. You have characters. You have a story to tell. Are the things your character's saying actually advancing the story? Are they moving things forward, or are they keeping them in place? And as long as you get yourself to a point where you know that you're moving forward, then it doesn't matter what anybody says, because any asshole can go out there and say that, your dialogue sounds like robots talking through Microsoft mic. Well, if you're talking like a robot while reading a comic, then it's going to sound like a robot said everything. And, dialogue is a really tricky thing to pull off, because a lot of it is so redundant. It's like having conversations with people. I mean, think about if you ever think about the kinds of things you say when you're trying to, for example, pick up on a girl at a bar or something like that. You're going to be delivering pretty cheesy lines in order to get their attention. You're thinking like you would if you were a hotshot movie actor trying to impress someone. And the same thing goes for me when I'm at comic conventions slinging Yu Sun Shin. Like, I say corny shit all the time. It's like whatever it takes to get people's attention and move forward with what I'm trying to do, the story I'm trying to pitch. So think of that when you're working on your dialogue, and I highly recommend that you find an editor that you can trust, someone who has experience in the field, and work with them to help hone those skills. Find books that you can read that will help you with this. I mentioned Will Eisner a couple times in this episode already, and the reason is because I'm reading his work right now. I've been digging into the spirit, and I'm doing it from my own experience. So these are things for you to consider, and just get out there and do it, and have fun with it. That's the most important thing. Anybody can tear you apart. I have been ripped apart all the time for my work. I got rejected by every single publisher out there. And you know what? It doesn't fucking matter. I still get out there and I still sell my book. And if you believe in what you're doing and you put in your best work, you have nothing to worry about. You will not be defeated in battle if you just go out there, do your best work, and get it into people's hands using whatever means are necessary. All right. Okay, guys. I'll see you next week with a brand new episode. Until then, onward to victory.